Today, I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. If you're watching, thank you for joining me. I am reading this to help with my own racial, social deconstruction. Chapter 5, Caught. Of all the evidence supporting Emerson's claim that the American nation was in fact two nations, most compelling was the exodus of slaves from one to the other. A very few, such as Douglass, who escaped from Maryland under his slave name Fred Bailey in 1838, or James W.C. Pennington, also enslaved in Maryland under the name Jim Pembroke until he escaped in 1826, or Jermaine Loguen, called Jarm Log in Tennessee, from which he fled in 1834, or William Wells Brown, who got out of Kentucky in the same year, became public figures whose lives were substantially recorded. Pennington became a minister in Brooklyn and officiated at the marriage ceremony for Douglass and his bride, Anna Murray, a free black woman from Maryland, on September 15th, 1838. Douglass transcribes the certificate of marriage in his narrative. Others less prominent, such as Charles Ball, who escaped from Georgia sometime in the 1830s, told their stories to witnesses who retold them for good, gain, or both. For the great majority, however, evidence of their lives is sparse. Scholars have tried to piece together a picture of the typical runaway, but the individual inevitably gets lost in the composite. More than 80% of fugitives appear to have been male. His age was somewhere between the late teens and mid-30s. He was likely to have been sold, sometimes repeatedly. In the case of slaves who were hired out in Virginia on the eve of the Civil War, some 10% of its 25,000 slaves were hired out, he might have chafed against the requirement that he relinquish most of what he earned. Probably he lived in or near a town or city, knew other slaves who had fled, and might have faced the impending sale of family, friends, or himself. For slave owners, losing a slave was, of course, a financial loss, though in cases of flight by horseback, which was rare but not unknown, the reward for returning the horse could be higher than returning the rider. The great majority of runaways made it only a few miles on foot before returning in discouragement or shackles. Even most who got farther remained nameless and faceless, known from newspaper descriptions. Yellow complexion, has a scar on his forehead, a little bald, very humble. Or if the advertiser was willing to pay for an illustration, from a stock image of a boy fleeing with his satchel or a girl running in silhouette. Human versions of the proverbial tree falling in the woods with no one near enough to hear it fall. It is almost impossible to conceive of the lives of the fallen. In his widely read book, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates imagines one slave's inner life. Slavery is not an indefinable mass of flesh. It is a particular, specific enslaved woman whose mind is as active as your own, whose range of feeling is as vast as your own, who prefers the way light falls in one particular spot in the woods, who enjoys fishing where the water eddies in a nearby stream, who loves her mother in her own complicated way, thinks her sister talks too loud, has a favorite cousin, a favorite season, who excels at dressmaking and knows inside herself that she is as intelligent and capable as anyone. Coates does not say if this woman tried to escape. If she did, anonymity might have been for her a bitter blessing. She might have gone north and contracted herself as a servant to a white family who, like many employers of illegal immigrants today, preferred to ask no questions. Or if she served on a plantation in the deep South, she might have hidden away for days, months in some cases, years, in the borderland between cleared ground and the swamp or forest beyond, sneaking back by night to planted fields or outbuildings to scavenge for food. Or especially before deforestation and draining of marshland became widespread, she might have joined a nomadic community of Maroons living beyond the reach of the slave patrols. Or perhaps she managed to take herself, alone or in a group, all the way to Florida, a thinly populated outpost of the Spanish Empire, until it became a U.S. territory in 1821, and which remained a haven for fugitive slaves for another 20 years until most Seminole Indians, among whom fugitives found shelter, had been killed or driven west by U.S. troops. Or she could have traveled north to Ontario, from which family and friends might never have heard from her again. Some runaways wrote to their masters or prevailed upon someone to write on their behalf to say they had reached Canada, while in fact they had gone underground in a nearby southern town or city to which they had fled or where they had been hired out. Most people, as the 20th century writer John Bartlow Martin remarked, seldom realize how much protection we derive from society simply because it is organized. If we disappear, we are missed by relatives, friends, employers, many others. In this respect, the experience of fugitive slaves was an inversion of most people's experience. They wanted to disappear. There were opportunities. By 1800, the population of free blacks in Philadelphia had risen to more than 6,000, in New York to some 3,500, and in Washington, D.C., where slavery remained legal until 1862, to roughly 1,000. Numbers that made it possible, if always perilous, for a fugitive to seek cover. Still, the eyes of every stranger felt intrusive. Today, when a young African American man feeling conspicuous among whites lowers his gaze, walks in the shadows, suppresses his rage if frisked by police or cursed by passers-by, he relives in some measure the demeaning or deadly experience of his forebears. Adopting a phrase first used to describe the decline of partisan rancor following the War of 1812, historians have named the immediate post-war period the era of good feelings. Applied to the issue of slavery, the claim is a stretch. Most incidents of flight and pursuit involve fugitive slaves took place, as the phrase goes, under the radar, but they were becoming sufficiently visible to spark what had been called a border war. Fighting was initially light and sporadic, certainly compared with what was to come in the 1830s, when mobs attacked free blacks and white abolitionists with stones and fire, or the 1850s, when free soilers and pro-slavery settlers fought pitched battles in what turned out to be a rehearsal for civil war. But even before the War of 1812, vigilantism was already serious enough to make clear that the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law intended to prescribe legal means for the recovery of runaways was not working. While the undeclared internal border war continued, the declared War of 1812 pitted the United States against its old enemy, Britain. Aiming to undermine the economy of their former subjects, just as they had done in trying to suppress the rebellion 30 years earlier, the British resumed enticing slaves with promises of freedom. They even assembled special battalions of fugitives, known as the Black Corps, who they hoped would have incentive to fight and none to desert because the enemy was likely to re-enslave them. In April 1814, Admiral Alexander Cochrane issued a carefully phrased statement, he never used the word slaves, proclaiming that, quote, all those who may be disposed to emigrate from the United States, unquote, would be received by British naval vassals and given the choice of joining British forces or sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or the West Indies, where they will meet with all due encouragement. The British Secretary of War, however, instructed his subordinates that they must on no account give encouragement to any disposition which may be manifested by the Negroes to rise against their masters, and should encourage enlistment only by slaves who, having already assisted British forces, may be exposed to the vengeance of their masters. Because enticement never became official policy, slaves seeking a new life beyond British lines were at the mercy of individual field commanders. According to one officer who marched in the British advance upon Washington in August 1814, the British General Robert Ross, determined to protect private property of every description, turned away scores of slaves who implored us to take them along with us, offering to serve either as soldiers or sailors. Nonetheless, from Virginia and Maryland alone, more than 3,000 slaves fled to British naval vessels close enough to be reached by raft or rowboat. After being armed and trained, hundreds returned ashore as night raiders. Nearly 50 years later, during the Civil War, Lincoln would speculate that the bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers on the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. While the number of black fighters on the British side in the War of 1812 never approached that many, during the Civil War some 200,000 would fight for the Union, they were numerous enough to make for uneasy sleep among plantation masters short of dependable sentries at night. As in other times of mass dislocation when endangered people must decide between running or huddling in place, young people led the way in choosing action over acquiescence. In her remarkable book, The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson describes the great migration in the 20th century by which millions of Southern blacks sought a better life in the North. To the old folks who stayed, she writes, the young people looked to be going in circles, chasing a wish. So perhaps it has always been the young readier than their elders to throw aside the known for the unknown. As British troops advanced into slave country, older slaves were more inclined to stay with the enemy they already knew than to take their chances with a self professed new friend. Among those who did flee, some took with them spouses, children, and even persuadable parents. Following the Revolution, the old war tradition of primogeniture, the right of the firstborn son to inherit his father's whole estate, had come under attack as a vestige of feudalism unsuited to a republic. Georgia abolished primogeniture in 1777, South Carolina in 1791. Inheritable property, including slave families, could now be broken up and distributed among multiple heirs, leaving plantation slaves in a new kind of jeopardy. The slave owning patriarch died intestate. His assets no longer passed intact to his eldest son, and even if a legal will existed, there might be room for sons to bargain not only over who got what portion of the acreage and silverware, but over the strongest farm hands and the prettiest slave girls. As chances went down for enslaved family members to stay together after the death of their owner, motivation to flee went up. Through the collaborative efforts of free blacks and anti slavery whites, the network of escape routes that came to be known as the Underground Railroad began to develop. Among the first conductors were Philadelphia Quakers, who specialized in slowing down rendition cases in local courts by using tactics, presenting a writ of habeas corpus, for example, to a sympathetic judge, whereby a captive could be released from detention while safe passage farther north was arranged before the plaintiff could reclaim him. Another hub was North Carolina, where as early as the second decade of the 19th century, runaways were taken along by families, also often Quakers, immigrating through the Cumberland Gap to the free Northwest. Like generations of illegal immigrants since, fugitive slaves were both dependent on and exploited by those who aided them. Some who helped were true Samaritans, motivated by hatred of slavery and sympathy for its victims. Others traded aid for money, labor, or sex. The white man, for example, who assisted four slaves to escape from Richmond in 1848, including Henry Box Brown, who became famous for having himself shipped north in a ventilated crate, charged it dearly for his services and has been described as not so much an abolitionist emissary as an opportunistic peddler. Even when there was no quid pro quo, the house, wagon, or makeshift shelter in which a fugitive was concealed was subject to sudden search by authorities looking for runaways or by gangs of ruffians moved by the prospect of large reward if they could scare them up. Whether in peacetime or wartime, it is impossible to know how many slaves felt desperate enough to take the risks. According to no less an authority than Frederick Douglass, under slavery, chronic fear sapped the will to imagine a different life. The people of the North, and free people generally, I think, have less attachment to the places where they are born and brought up than have the slaves. Their freedom to go and come, to be here and there as they list, prevents any extravagant attachment to any one particular place in their case. On the other hand, the slave is a fixture. He has no choice, no goal, no destination, but is pegged down to a single spot and must take root here or nowhere. The idea of removal elsewhere comes generally in the shape of a threat and in punishment of a crime. It is therefore attended with fear and dread, like that of a living man going to the tomb, who with open eyes sees himself buried out of sight, and hearing of wife, children, and friends of kindred tie. But sometimes fear gave way to desperation. In 1817, the Philadelphian Jesse Torrey published a compilation of stories about black people kidnapped or chained in groups trudging south or displayed on the auction block. Titled A Portraiture of Domestic Slavery in the United States. One of the most devastating stories was of Anna, a mother enslaved in Delaware until she was moved to a Washington tavern that doubled as a slave pen, from which she was scheduled to be sold. Upon learning that she would be separated from her children, she leaped from a third-floor window, shattering her arms and breaking her back. It was unclear whether survival was to her a curse or a blessing. Anna's story became, as the historian Edward Baptiste has called it, a media scandal, one of the first eruptions of the human cost of slavery into the national consciousness. It was accompanied in Torrey's book by a striking engraving that rendered Anna less as a tumbling body than as a levitating angel floating above what looks to modern eyes like a scene from a film noir, with dark doorways and ominous shadows sweeping across the cobblestone street. In the subtitle of his book, Torrey captured the fundamental problem that, despite the best efforts by the best legal minds, could never be resolved. Reflections on the practicability of restoring the moral rights of the slave without impairing the legal privileges of the possessor. One who was stopped by the impasse was the Virginia Congressman John Randolph. An orator of great power, Randolph was outraged by the cruelty that drove Anna to madness, if that's what it was, and railed against slave drivers who pushed mothers beyond endurance. He owned over 400 slaves, whom he emancipated in his will, much to the dismay of the relatives hoping to inherit them, and provided funds for their resettlement in Ohio. Among the first to call for an end to the slave trade in the nation's capital, he promised personally to ferret out its villainous practitioners from their holes and corners. There was a plausible story that upon seeking a woman sewing garments to be sent abroad to fighters in the Greek Revolution, a popular cause for Northerners and Southerners alike, he called her attention to a passing group of ill-clad slaves and said, "Madam, the Greeks are at your door." Yet if anyone perfected the art of self-contradiction, it was Randolph. Whenever he spoke at length in the House, which was often, he was attended for his refreshment by a slave carrying a jug of ale. After a swallow or two, he would launch into lamenting his misfortune to be, and to have been, a slaveholder, while warning at the same time that abuses such as those that tormented Anna would someday persuade Congress to use war as a pretext to abolish slavery altogether. It would be done, he predicted, on grounds of military necessity, just as Madison and the younger Lawrence had contemplated during the Revolution, except that next time emancipation would be forced upon the slave owners without compensation. Randolph thus joined a long line of Virginians, including Patrick Henry, who worried that the federal government would someday invoke its war powers in order to pronounce all slaves free. Apart from the fact that when wartime emancipation did finally arrive on January 1st, 1863, it would not come by an act of Congress but by presidential proclamation. He turned out to be impressively prophetic. In his ability to attack and defend slavery simultaneously, Randolph was a descendant of Jeffreys and Madison, but in his fear of federal intervention, he foreshadowed Calhoun. He could have been the subject of one of Mark Twain's wicked riffs on the universal human talent for moral incoherence. Here, writing ostensibly about a native Australasian who he encountered on his Pacific travels, Twain captures, perhaps as only a Southern writer could, the self-division of which Randolph was an early exemplar. He takes his reluctant bride by force. He courts her with a club, and then loves her faithfully through a long life. It is of record. He gathers to himself another wife by the same processes, beats and bangs her as a daily diversion, and by lays down his life in defending her from some outside harm. It is of record. He will face 100 hostiles to rescue one of his children, and will kill another of his children because the family is large enough without it. His delicate stomach turns at certain details of the white man's food, but he likes overripe fish and braised dog and cat and rat, and will eat his own uncle with relish. He is a sociable animal, yet he turns aside and hides behind his shield when his mother-in-law goes by. John Randolph had no wife to beat, and therefore no mother-in-law to fear, nor did he, presumably, eat rat, dog, or his uncle. But it is of record that he defended and denounced slavery with equal indignation. Like Jefferson and Madison, he reminded anyone who needed reminding that slavery drove slave owners, at least the reflective ones, into a labyrinth of contradictions. Runaway slaves had always posed a particular problem for conflicted slave owners. They exposed the gap between myth, the inferiority of slaves and the benignity of masters, and reality, the courage it took to run away and the risk of retribution. Now, as they moved from the periphery towards the center of public awareness, their determination to seek freedom became more and more alarming to one side of the national divide and encouraging to the other. During the 1820s, American diplomats made repeated appeals to Britain seeking return of fugitive slaves who had fled to British Canada during the War of 1812. As late as 1826, Secretary of State Henry Clay was still urging the American minister in London, Albert Gallatin, to press the case for returning fugitive slaves who had found sanctuary in Britain's North American territories. 2 years later, Gallatin's successor, James Barber, continued to seek British cooperation on the grounds that every successful attempt at elopement constituted a strong allurement for other slaves to abscond. As had been the case after the Revolution, all these efforts got nowhere. Rebuffed with curt reminders that on the Somerset precedent, the British government would not depart from the principles recognized by the British courts, that every man is free who reaches British ground. When it came to dealing with Spain, a much weaker power than Britain, diplomacy was a cursory preface to military action. In the spring of 1816, with slaves fleeing in alarming numbers from coastal Georgia to the Spanish colony of Florida, the Spanish fort at Pensacola had become, according to one American naval officer, a rendezvous for runaway slaves, an asylum where they found arms and ammunition to protect themselves against their owners and the government. General Andrew Jackson, hero of the last battle of the War of 1812 at New Orleans, regarded these fugitives as nothing more than lawless banditti and issued a perfunctory demand that the Spanish governor give them up. In the absence of a satisfactory response, Jackson's subordinates sent an artillery assault of red-hot shot into the fort's magazine. Writing some 20 years later about the attack, William J., grandson of John J., claimed that more than 200 men, women, and children died in the ensuing explosion. Within the borders of the United States, tension over the fugitive problem continued to increase. In 1820, the Maryland legislature complained that Pennsylvanians were resorting to force in order to thwart recovery of fugitives by their legal owners. From Louisiana in 1827 came denunciation of self-styled philanthropists in the North who think themselves justified in the use of every possible means by which they can rob a Southern master of a slave. And as always, some people figured out how to make money from misery. In 1835, a group of investors in Richmond organized the Virginia Slave Insurance Company, quote, with powers and authority to make the insurance upon slaves absconding from their owners. Slave states tried to crack down. Throughout the South, black people, free as well as enslaved, were banned from riverboats and vessels capable of travel by sea. Free black sailors on ships berthed in southern ports were jailed in order to prevent them from smuggling slaves aboard for embarkation to the north. Slave patrols were fortified to make flight by land more difficult. Shoes issued to reduce the chance of foot injury or infection by the hookworm parasite, a common route of infection was through the bare sole, that could sideline a slave from work, were collected at night to reduce the chance of escape. An 1822 statute in Missouri prescribed a 9 p.m. curfew requiring that any slave out after dark be returned to his master for compulsory whipping. If the owner failed to comply, a fine was imposed. Also in danger were white people suspecting of encouraging slaves to run away. In 1819, a white Methodist elder in Maryland was indicted for preaching anti-slavery sermons intended, according to his accusers, to incite slaves to flee. The scarcity of similar court cases in the ensuing years suggest how completely the South closed ranks. Anti-slavery agitation was moving in inverse proportion to the size of the local slave population. It subsided in the South while it gathered forces in the North. In mid-century Mississippi, where the number of slaves was approaching 400,000, organized anti-slavery activity was all but over. Meanwhile, Concord, Massachusetts, where free blacks accounted for roughly 1% of the population, where there were, of course, no slaves at all, became a hub of abolitionism. One result of this asymmetry was that whites charged in Southern courts with sedition on behalf of slaves were increasingly likely to be transplanted Northerners who ran afoul of local laws. While living in Baltimore in 1829, the Northern abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, for example, published an article in a local anti-slavery paper, edited by a New Jersey-born Quaker, Benjamin Lundy, calling for slave traders to be sentenced to solitary confinement for life and sent to the lowest depths of perdition in the afterlife. He took particular aim at fellow New Englander Francis Todd, a ship owner born in Garrison's native town of Newburyport, Massachusetts, who hired out his vessel for transporting slaves from Maryland to New Orleans. Having excoriated Todd as a sordid illustration of New England humanity and morality, who deserved a thick infamy, Garrison was convicted for libel and jailed for nearly 2 months until the wealthy New York abolitionist Arthur Tappan paid his fee. 2 years later, the Connecticut-born physician Reuben Crandall, brother of the well-known abolitionist Prudence Crandall, was tried in Washington, D.C. for distributing anti-slavery pamphlets. Although ultimately acquitted, Crandall became a symbol of abolitionist incursion into the South at a time when anti-slavery activity had shifted almost entirely to the North. The prosecutor in the Crandall case, District Attorney Francis Scott Key, was destined to become famous as the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, which includes a rarely sung verse blaming the British for using fugitive servants or slaves as mercenaries during the War of 1812. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Like John Randolph, Key was a man bristling with contradictions. He regarded abolitionists as fanatics who, by calling for a quick end to slavery, risked destroying white America by opening the way to racial amalgamation. Because the great moral and political evil amongst us was not slavery, but the whole colored race itself. A better way to deal with the slavery problem would be to purify the nation by sending the slaves back to Africa. Nonetheless, Key was sufficiently moved by the plight of a slave mother facing the prospect of being sold away from her children that he helped to raise money to buy her and her children's freedom. Outside the courts, Southerners continued to accuse Northerners of colluding with slave stealers, while Northerners accused Southerners of sending thugs across the border to abduct not just fugitive slaves, but any human prey that might fetch a good price in the flesh market back home. It is impossible to know how many or how often free blacks were kidnapped for the purpose of sale into slavery, but it happened often enough to become an inflammatory issue. The original name of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, founded in 1775, was the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. Writing in 1817, Jesse Torrey reported the case of a Philadelphia black man who made a practice of marrying black women, then selling them across the border in Maryland or Virginia. As late as 1836 in New Hampshire, a destitute black boy was sold to an Alabama slave owner by the local white man with whom the child had been lodged by the overseers of the poor. The following year, the anti-slavery paper National Enquirer and Constitutional Advocate of Universal Liberty reported a surge of kidnapping, including a free black woman along with her 6 children. Light complexion was no short protection. Because centuries of interracial sexual relations had made skin color an unreliable standard by which to distinguish black from white, race came to be defined less as a matter of color than of blood. Slave states established elaborate legal taxonomies by which people were characterized as quadroons or octoroons. Typical was an 1822 Virginia law classifying any person with one Negro parent as a mulatto, depending on how tainted with black blood they were deemed to be. Aside from the text, it's worth noting that Hitler thought that was going too far. He was fine with everything else, though. Some persons defined by genealogy as black thus found themselves separated from the white race by a line of division so faint that it can only be traced by the keen eye of prejudice. Not only fugitive slaves, but also anyone of low social standing, including vagabonds, migrant laborers, and petty criminals who might have been physically indistinguishable from free whites, was vulnerable to being seized, bought, and sold as a slave. In 1841, the Ohio legislature threatened war against Virginia for its failure to extradite 4 Virginians who had kidnapped 3 white men in Ohio to be sold in Kentucky. Kidnapping was also a threat to white abolitionists. In 1838, an Ohio man was seized and taken to Virginia, where he was tarred and feathered. Please look that up. It is awful. In 1845, 3 Ohioans accused of aiding fugitive slaves were jailed in Virginia until Ohio's governor stepped in to have them released. Women and children were particularly vulnerable to abduction. Shocker. Writing in The Philanthropist in 1836, James G. Birney called for strengthening anti-kidnapping laws in order to reduce the risk of white women's being captured and sold into sex slavery. They are in the South already, he wrote, slaves as white as any of us, who have in our veins the purest Saxon blood. The whiter the slave, especially if it be a female, the more extravagant the price, the more desirable the victim. A columnist for the Western Citizen writing in 1845 agreed. Without legal security against kidnapping, The whitest and best known free child in the city of Chicago would be subject to capture and enslavement. His alarm was not baseless. In the late 1850s, a 15-year-old girl who had escaped from the man who had bought her at a New Orleans slave auction sued for her freedom on the grounds that she was white. Her lawyers claimed that her whiteness was on view not only in her blue eyes and blonde hair, but in her modest behavior, impossible to emulate even by a light mulatto, which the defense claimed her to be. However common or rare were the kidnapping incidents, the specter of white slavery was one factor behind the rash of personal liberty laws adopted in the 1830s and 1840s by northern states seeking to throw up legal obstacles blocking out-of-state agents from seizing persons accused of being fugitives from slavery. In 1835, Gerrit Smith announced with strategic exaggeration that the question now is not merely nor mainly whether the blacks of the South shall remain slaves, but whether the whites at the North shall become slaves also. No doubt Smith was speaking metaphorically, but his metaphor touched a nerve. That slavery posed a menace not only to blacks, but to whites became a keynote in stump speeches by anti-slavery politicians, including eventually Lincoln, who warned in the 1850s that no one, regardless of color, was safe from the slave power. Poets and fiction writers were ahead of the politicians in understanding that tales of white slaves had a horror story fascination. As early as 1797, the Boston author Royal Tyler, in a novel titled The Algerine Captive, told the story of a white physician who serves as a surgeon on a slave ship before falling into slavery himself at the hands of Algerian captors. In 1835, the French writer Gustave de Beaumont, who had traveled in America with Alexis de Tocqueville, published an essay on the race in the form of the novel Marie, or Slavery in the United States. The story of a young Frenchman and his American bride whose admixtures of African blood provoke such ostracism that the couple is driven into exile among Cherokee Indians who give them shelter. The following year saw the first full-scale literary treatment of the tragic mulatto theme, Richard Hildreth's novel, The Slave, or Memoirs of Archie Moore. Hildreth was a scholarly Bostonian who, for reasons of health, had spent several months on a Florida plantation. Described by one newspaper as an abolitionist pamphlet in the guise of a stirring and interesting work of fiction, his book was composed in the first-person voice and published pseudonymously, as if Archie had written himself. It told the tale of a son of a slave owner and his concubine whose, quote, trace of African blood, by which her veins were contaminated, imparted to her complexion a peculiar richness, and whose flashing dark eyes completed a picture which might perhaps be matched by Spain or Italy, but for which it would be in vain to seek a rival among the pale-faced, languid beauties of eastern Virginia. Archie, child of this mixed-blood beauty and her white master's son, is tormented in boyhood by his racial ambiguity and, upon achieving manhood, encounters rapacious planters who regard his own alluring light-skinned wife as a luxury to be passed around like a good cognac. After he is impressed into the British Navy, his pent-up rage explodes and he fights in the War of 1812 for the crown. At a time when many bookshops, in the North as well as the South, refused to stock abolition tracts as if they were a form of pornography, Hildreth's book helped make the subject respectable, appearing in subsequent editions under his own name and with a more explicit title, Archie Moore, the White Slave. The fact of racial mixing revealed a reality that slave owners preferred, of course, to suppress. Every lady, wrote one straight-talking mistress of a South Carolina plantation, tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own she seems to think dropped from the clouds. The sordid truth was that once a slave girl reached puberty, doubtless sometime sooner, She became the object of white men's demands and could never draw a clear line between coercion and consent. While visiting the South in the 1840s, the British naturalist Charles Lyell was struck that the female slave is proud of her connection with a white man and thinks it is an honor to have a mulatto, hoping it will be better provided for than a black child. Years later, Harriet Jacobs provided some personal context for that remark. Looking back to her adolescence, she was born in 1813, she recalled that when she is 14 or 15, an enslaved girl's owner or his sons or the overseers, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If she did not respond willingly, she could expect to be initiated into what amounted to a lifetime of serial rape. More and more writers took up the theme. A play of unknown authorship, The Kidnapped Clergyman, probably never performed but evidently known to anti slavery activists in its printed version, appeared in 1839 about a pompous white minister who, in the midst of congratulating himself for preaching against abolitionists, is kidnapped by a slave trader and sold as a runaway. But not before being forced to watch his daughter carried off by a buyer who pays well for her carnal services. In 1842, the abolitionist annual, The Liberty Bell, Lydia Maria Child's story, The Quadroons, told the tale of two beautiful mixed-race women in Georgia, mother and daughter, who are seduced. When they resisted, threats took the place of persuasion, then abandoned by white men who move on to other pleasures. That same year, in The Quadroon Girl, America's unofficial poet laureate, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, portrayed a planter under financial duress who overcomes his scruples. The voice of nature was too weak. He took the glittering gold, and he sells his honey-hued daughter for use by the buyer as a sex slave. Quote, her eyes were like a falcon's, gray. Her arms and neck were bare. No garment she wore save a kirtle gay, and her own long raven hair. Then pale as death grew the maiden's cheek, her hands as icy cold. The slaver led her from the door, he led her by the hand, to be his slave and paramour in a strange and distant land. The shock that fugitives encountered in the North at the idea of white slavery was both an opportunity and an offense. It was an opportunity because the image of the enslaved white woman made slavery feel closer to Northern whites. It was an offense because white outrage seemed reserved for cases where slavery ensnared one of their own. One British visitor, upon inspecting Hope Slatter's infamous Baltimore slave pen, was stunned to find imprisoned there two women whose complexion was so near white as to attract particular attention, and was even more astonished to learn that they were sisters and the children of their master. In 1843, when the Ohio Methodist minister Calvin Fairbank raised funds from Levi Coffin, Salmon P. Chase, and the other anti-slavery leaders in order to buy a light-skinned girl at a Kentucky auction, he was moved to rescue her because she was said to be only 1/64th black, below what he deemed a reasonable threshold for enslavement. After unbuttoning her dress to exhibit her superb neck and breast, the auctioneer, by Fairbank's account, was dissatisfied with the bids, and so, lifting her skirts, laid bare her beautiful symmetrical body from her feet to her waist, and with his brutal sacrilegious hand smote her white flesh, exclaiming, "Ah, gentlemen, who is going to be the winner of this prize? Whose is the next bid?" Then came the moral of this story. There was a line that decent people, Southerners no less than Northerners, would not cross. "Shame! Shame!" they cried, and Boston and New Orleans shed tears, wept side by side. This kind of writing had the character of an anti-pornography tract that invites the readers to disapprove publicly while privately savoring the evidence. There would have been less shame if her flesh had been less white. Trading in slaves of fair complexion involved risk intermingled with excitement. On the other hand, a light skinned fancy girl, deemed suitable as a sexual servant, commanded a premium price. On the other hand, she posed a constant risk of slipping away and melting into the white world. Too white to keep became a term of the trade. In the North, light skinned slaves traveling with their masters provoked astonishment as if they were circus animals run amok. Others were ogled. When the fair skinned Harriet Powell, as elegant as she was voluptuous, fled her Mississippi master in 1839 during a trip to Syracuse, New York, the former slave Germaine Loguen remarked with sardonic amusement that she awakened curiosity and indignation among some who had no objection to black slavery. Having never seen a woman so white and attractive held as property, crowds of citizens and strangers caught her by attractions, turned to look at her as she passed by. A decade later, when the white marble figure, the Greek slave, created in 1843 by the Vermont-born sculptor Hiram Powers, went on tour in the North, it triggered a flood of editorials, essays, and poems. By the 1850s, numerous copies had been made and were touring Britain and the United States, and mass-produced souvenir statuettes proved enormously popular. Who can know what proportions of prurience and sympathy drew crowds to this ravishing nude in chains? Modeled after well-known classical versions of Venus in a pose of modesty, the sculpture must have shocked 19th century viewers with the incongruity of the goddess in chains. Somewhere beyond her is an unseen man holding the key to the lock, to whom we know the girl must yield once he arrives. Through her posture, provisionally at rest, head and eyes averted from the viewer, voyeur, one hand helping to support her body's weight, the other partially screening her genitals. The sculptor conveys her anxious shame while implicating the viewer in the excitement of watching and waiting. For some, she doubtless provided a certain sadistic pleasure in imagining her sexual degradation, while others felt the uneasy gratitude expressed in the proverb, "There but for the grace of God go I." No doubt more than a few viewers felt a combination of both. Yet, even as literature and art began to grapple one way or another with the problem of slavery, political institutions stayed remarkably inert. Some 60 years after adaptation of the Constitution, the states, in Tocqueville's words, remained the 24 little sovereign nations, and Congress little more than a periodic gathering of independent emissaries. The united in United States was still a gross exaggeration. In May 1836, in one of the true ostrich moments in American history, Congress tried to shut down discussion of slavery altogether. Hoping to restore tranquility to the public mind, the House of Representatives resolved that all petitions demanding action against slavery be tabled immediately upon receipt without debate. The gag rule, as the moratorium came to be known after John Quincy Adams, protesting the violation of his First Amendment rights, demanded to know, "Am I gagged or am I not?" was reaffirmed annually for almost a decade, until party discipline among Southern and Northern Democrats broke down and the rule was rescinded in December 1844. As much as it may seem in retrospect a rash act of suppression, the gag rule was seen as a rational or at least a comprehensible response to the increasingly manifest fact that the question of slavery had become impervious to compromise. Most accounts of the antebellum years stress the growing divide between the North and South, but on the matter of racial animus, it is a mistake to draw too bright a dividing line. By and large, Northerners wanted to stop the inflow of runaways as much as Southerners wanted to stop the outflow. As early as 1803, within a year after Ohio achieved statehood, its General Assembly passed an act to regulate black and mulatto persons, decreeing that no Negro or mulatto should be allowed to settle in the state unless he could furnish a certificate from some court of his actual freedom, and that blacks already living in the state must register with the county clerk. Illinois, to which Lincoln moved from Indiana in 1830, had passed a law 11 years ago requiring blacks entering the state to post a $1,000 bond guaranteeing good behavior. A law designed to ensure that the state would not become a retreat for runaway slaves. In 1820, the legislature of Missouri, a slave state peninsula jutting into free territory, approved a constitution forbidding free Negroes and mulattoes from coming to and settling in the state. Black Americans were thus caught between one region that wished to keep them as slave laborers and another that did not want them at all. Connecticut restricted the franchise to white males in 1818, a year earlier than Alabama. In 1838, Pennsylvania revoked the voting rights of black men. In 1844, the Provisional Government of the Oregon Country passed a law banning slavery while prescribing whipping and expulsion for former slaves who did not leave the state upon their emancipation. Even in Massachusetts, from which slavery was long gone, many whites loathed slavery and feared emancipation at the same time. It was a contradiction with a long history. As early as 1700, the jurist Samuel Sewall, best known for his role in hanging witches at Salem, conceded that New England was culpable in forcing the Africans to become slaves among ourselves, yet declared that black people could never grow up into orderly families or coexist with whites in civilized society. Without some scheme for colonizing them out of the country, he feared, they would remain in our body politic as a kind of extravasat blood. Blood, that is, that leaks through its vessels and seeps into the body as a slow poison. A century later, not much had changed. In 1795, John Adams noted that the depth of popular hostility in his home state towards slaves as well as slave owners. If the gentlemen had been permitted to hold slaves, he wrote, the common white people would have put the slaves to death and their masters too, perhaps. Adams was a careful writer who knew exactly what he was doing when he gave the benefit of the perhaps only to the masters. Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, sincerely believed that nothing would be more false and heartless than this doctrine which makes the first and holiest rights of humanity to depend on the color of the skin. Nevertheless, he found himself disgusted by Desdemona's passion in Othello for a rude, unbleached African soldier, and declared that the great moral lesson of Shakespeare's play is that the black and white blood cannot be intermingled in marriage without a gross outrage upon the law of nature. Writing in the same year, Tocqueville reported that race prejudice seems stronger in those states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists. Nearly 20 years later, in 1854, William J. Watkins, born to free parents in Baltimore, described racial animus among the white Northerners as more virulent than anything he had encountered in the South. Also in the 1850s, one medical authority, who had been described as perhaps the first professional racist in American history, answered the pesky question of how it could be that a Negro child, in some respects, at the same age, is more intelligent than the white child, by likening black children to domestic animals, whose development at first paces that of human infants, but are soon enough overtaken by the more advanced species. These observations appear in a book titled Negroes and Negro Slavery, the first an inferior race, the latter its normal condition, written in New York, not New Orleans. Not only was Northern racism rampant, but it was generous in scope. In 1837, before he began speaking out publicly against slavery, Emerson confided to his notebook that it cannot be maintained by any candid person that the African race have ever occupied or do promise to ever occupy any very high place in the human family. Their present condition is the strongest proof that they cannot. The Irish cannot. The American Indians cannot. The Chinese cannot. Before the energy of the Caucasian race, all the other races have quailed and done obeisance. Even Theodore Parker, the Massachusetts clergyman who was an early and passionate abolitionist, considered Africans at the bottom in respect to power of civilization, though he thought they might rise in the ranks. Whatever the relative intensity of racist feeling in free states and slave states, very few whites in America were free from what Emerson called natural color phobia, which he was honest enough to admit he controlled in his own case only by moral conviction. In 1844, the anti slavery activist Gerrit Smith, a notable exception to the color phobia rule, summed up what fugitives from the slave South faced in the so called Free North. The laws and usages, he wrote, by which the free people of color in the northern states are vexed, hampered, outraged, crushed, constitute so gratuitous, so wantonly wicked a chiming with the slaveholding policy of the South, and so indispensable a crop of this policy, as to make them not less guilty than her bloodiest slave codes. Every fugitive knew the usages. Aboard ship on Long Island Sound, Douglas was forced to sleep on the freezing deck, and while traveling by railroad through New England, was dragged from the cars for the crime of being colored. When another refugee from Maryland, Henry Highland Garnett, who had escaped as a child with his family in 1824, was admitted to the Noyes Academy in New Hampshire in 1835, local farmers hitched a team of oxen to a campus building and pulled it down. Later that night, shots were fired into the house where Garnett, his friend Alexander Crummell, and other black students boarded. Speaking in England in 1849, William Wells Brown told his audience that the slave is just as much a slave in the city of Boston as he is in Charleston, South Carolina. He is just as much a slave in any of the eastern states as he is in the southern states. After fleeing from North Carolina in 1842, Harriet Jacobs found employment with a family in New York City, where one of her duties was to take their daughter to and from the studio of an artist hired to paint the girl's portrait. Because streetcars were closed to black passengers, she had to make the 6-mile trek on foot unless the conductor was moved to relent by the beseeching eyes of a white child clutching her black nursemaid's hand. Upon discovering that prejudice against color is stronger north than south, Douglas's words, fugitives from slavery found themselves living as strangers in a not-so-strange land. And yet by 1840, more than 1,000 anti-slavery societies had sprung up in the free states, many of which included former slaves. How could racial animosity and anti-slavery sentiment coexist so cordially? Part of the answer is that even as moral outrage at slavery rose among whites, so did fear of blacks. Opposing slavery and hating its victims, Douglas observed, has come to be a very common form of abolitionism. White people of strong anti-slavery feeling, including such luminaries as Harriet Beecher Stowe and, for a time, Lincoln, kept company with slave owners like Henry Clay in favoring the colonization of former slaves somewhere outside the country at a safe remove in Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, or Canada. Others proposed colonization within the United States itself. Even as sympathetic an advocate as Gerrit Smith, who donated 120,000 lands of acre in upstate New York to poor blacks for the purposes of their settlement, seemed to recognize that for the foreseeable future, the prospect of fully integrating free blacks or former slaves into white society was remote. With few exceptions, such as Charles Sumner, who initially argued for integrating the public schools of Boston, opponents of slavery were not necessarily committed to the dignity, much less the political or social equality of its victims. The same newspapers that published sympathetic stories about Harriet Powell's flight to freedom carried advertisements for minstrel shows. Another part of that answer is that American society, North and South, has never been uniform in mood or sentiment, and its internal divisions have never fallen neatly along geographic dividing lines. In Pennsylvania, even as black men were denied the franchise, the self emancipating department of the anti slavery movement was booming as hundreds of fugitives, attracting deep interest manifested by the inhabitants in their success and safety, were continually passing through the central part of the state on their way to the north. By the fourth decade of the century, it was unremarkable for an African American shopkeeper in Boston to conduct a profitable business serving white clients. Yet, when a successful black store owner bought a pew in the Park Street Church, his appearance and that of his family in that fashionable house of worship, according to the abolitionist Oliver Johnson, was accounted by all of Boston as an outrage scarcely less flagrant than the use of a pew as a pigeon. The compatibility of racial contempt with anti slavery conviction was something Northern politicians well understood. During his rise to power, Lincoln was not above appealing to both, as when he opposed the expansion of slavery on the grounds that the best prevention of amalgamation between blacks and whites would be to keep them apart. He regarded the forced concubinage of enslaved women as morally reprehensible, but he also objected on the grounds that it accounted for 9/10 of all of the mulattoes, all the mixing of blood in the nation. When Ohio Senator Thomas Corwin opposed the introduction of slaves into the West, it was not on their behalf, but because the slave has brought trouble wherever he has set down his black foot. Southerners tried using this argument, that blacks are irredeemably primitive, as a way to convince Northerners that it was in their own interest to close their borders to runaways. Sensible people, wrote Edgar Allan Poe in 1845, should shut their ears to negrophiliac old ladies of the North, who, he noted in a swipe at a literary rival, form so large a part of Mr. Longfellow's friends, and who wail and moan on behalf of subhuman people they know nothing about. On this view, slave hunters were not hired thugs, but public-spirited citizens doing Northerns a favor by keeping the wretches out. If slavery was an asset to the South, it was also a burden, and Northerners should be grateful to their Southern brethren for bearing it. Besides, once slaves in the South came to understand that they were not wanted in the North, the flow of fugitives would slow, and sooner or later it would stop. This was nonsense, of course, as today's migrants from the Middle East to Western Europe or from Latin America to the United States should remind us. No amount of hatred or hostility on the receiving end will prevent refugees from coming if the conditions from which they seek refuge are desperate enough.